All right, let's talk about one of the most intense economic moments pretty much any of us have ever lived through, the 2008 financial crisis. We're going to break down how the US Federal Reserve basically had to tear up its own rule book and write a new one on the fly to keep the entire global economy from going off a cliff. So that's the big question, right? In 2008, the whole system was on the verge of just stopping. And the Fed's usual bag of tricks, it just wasn't going to be enough, not even close. So we're going to get into the really innovative and, pretty controversial tools the Fed had to come up with to pull us all back from the brink. But look, before we get to the solution, you have to understand the problem. And this wasn't your average downturn. This was a crisis of trust. Think of the financial system like the plumbing in a house. Well, in 2008, that plumbing got completely clogged, and the flow of money just stopped. Yeah, at its very core, the problem was just pure fear. Banks and other financial firms were suddenly terrified to lend money to anyone, even each other, because nobody knew who was secretly holding a bunch of toxic debt. This caused the markets the banks used to lend to each other overnight, the absolute bedrock of the economy, to just freeze solid. And when that happens, credit stops flowing to regular businesses and families, and that's how a financial crisis threatens to become a real economic catastrophe.
Okay, so what did the Fed do? Well, its first move was to act like an emergency plumber for the whole system. For 100 years, they'd been the lender of last resort. But this crisis forced them to completely rethink what that even meant.
And this is where things got really wild. The Fed basically shattered its own long-standing rules. For decades, it would only lend to traditional commercial banks. But the panic was way bigger than that now. It had spread to investment banks, to money market funds, places where companies park their cash to make payroll. To stop the bleeding, the Fed had to invent a whole alphabet soup of new lending programs, essentially opening its doors to almost the entire financial world. So let's talk about this key idea, liquidity. It's a simple concept. Imagine you own a house. It's super valuable, right? But you can't use it to buy a coffee. You need cash for that. During the crisis, even really good assets, stuff that was normally super easy to sell, suddenly became illiquid. Nobody wanted to buy them. The Fed stepped in to be the buyer, providing that essential cash by lending against these frozen assets just to get the system moving again. And what they were doing was actually based on this classic idea from a 19th century writer named Walter Bagehot. His rule was basically the crisis fighting 101 for central banks. When panic hits, lend freely. The Fed just took that old principle and applied it to the 21st century financial system, stretching the definition of solvent institutions and good collateral in ways Bagehot probably couldn't have even imagined. But here's the thing, all that emergency lending, that was just triage. That was about stopping the panic. The economy itself was already in a massive recession, and the Fed also had to figure out how to get it growing again. And this is the moment of truth. The Fed's main tool, its gas pedal for the economy, is the federal funds rate. They cut it to make borrowing cheaper and get people spending. But by December of 2008, they had slammed that pedal all the way to the floor. It was at zero. You can't go lower than zero.
So what do you do? I mean, really, what do you do when your most powerful weapon is completely tapped out? The Fed was facing this huge challenge. It had to find some other way to lower borrowing costs for the things that really matter to people, like mortgages and business loans. So they turned to a new, and let's be honest, pretty controversial tool called quantitative easing, or just QE. It sounds complicated, but here's the basic idea. The Fed digitally created money out of thin air. Then it used that new money to buy huge amounts of long-term bonds from the market. When this huge new buyer, the Fed, started buying up all these bonds, their prices went up. And here's the trick. When a bond's price goes up, its interest rate, or yield, goes down. It was a brand new way to directly push down the cost of mortgages and business loans. And the scale of this was just astronomical. I mean, look at these numbers. We're talking over $1.7 trillion. The whole point was to directly impact the borrowing costs for millions of Americans, to try and put a floor under the collapsing housing market and get businesses investing again. But the Fed didn't just use its checkbook, it also used its words. It's a tool they call forward guidance. In a moment of absolute chaos and uncertainty, the Fed came out and made a public promise to keep interest rates super low for a long, long time. And that wasn't just talk. It was a powerful way to shape expectations and give businesses and families the confidence to go out and borrow or invest because they knew the rug wasn't going to be pulled out from under them anytime soon. And you know what?
This wild combination of actions actually worked. It helped pull the economy back from the edge of a second Great Depression. But in doing so, it totally rewrote the central banking playbook. So what did we learn from all this? What lessons can we take to prepare for the next crisis? Well, a whole new playbook was written. The biggest lesson? Our financial system is so interconnected now that a central bank has to be ready to help more than just traditional banks. But with that kind of power comes huge responsibilities. It means you need tougher regulations to stop firms from getting too big to fail. It means you have to be transparent about what you're doing. And maybe most importantly, you absolutely have to have a clear plan for how to put all these powerful new tools back in the box once the emergency is over. And that really leaves us with this huge final question. In saving the economy, the Fed's power and influence just exploded. And that raises some really tough questions about moral hazard. If you bail everyone out, does it just encourage them to be reckless again in the future? The playbook for fighting a crisis is a lot bigger now, for sure. But the challenges and the debates about the Fed's proper role are bigger too. And that's a conversation that's still very much happening today.